So what happens when we die? Is all of creation and all of humanity moving towards a appointed end and an appointed goal? And those are big questions, and those are the questions we're talking about today. So really look forward to this. Let's get to it. Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to the School of Faith. I am Hutch and I am your host, and today we're just going to do a quick overview of eschatology. And so the question really of eschatology is a natural one. I mean, the doctrine or the concept of last things isn't something that is at all peculiar to the Christian faith. Wherever people have kind of seriously reflected on human life, whether that's individual human life or whether that's human life considered as a lump, so the destiny of all humanity, they've not just asked the question, how did this come to be, but they've also kind of raised the question of, like, where are we going? Or what is the final destiny of the individual, or what is the final destiny of all of creation? And so the questions that are involved in eschatology are really very profound. So those questions are things like, does man perish at death? Is his existence just snuffed out completely? Or is there some sort of entrance into another state of existence? Will the generations of humanity simply come and go and come and go in a sort of endless cycle? Or is all of history moving towards a telos, a purpose, a goal that has been designed for it by God? And these questions have been confronted and dealt with in a number of ways. I mean, so we can see the question kind of arise or crop up in the area of philosophy. And so the question of the final destiny of the individual and of the human race has occupied an important place in the thought of philosophers as well as theologians. So Plato, for example, taught the immortality of the human soul, namely its continued existence after death. And this position really remained a very important part of his philosophy right up to the present in the thought of modern Platonists and the Neoplatonists. Now, Spinoza didn't have a place for it at all, and Wolff and Leibniz defended the soul and eschatology with all sorts of arguments. Kant, he kind of stressed that the arguments that were made in this particular area were untenable, but he also retained the concept of immortality as a necessary postulate of natural reason. And yet the idealist philosophy of the 19th century would totally rule out the possibility of immortality. But it's not just that the philosophers, right, reflect on the future of the individual. Others thought deeply about the future of the world, right? So you have the Stoics who spoke of successive world cycles, and you have the Buddhists who speak of world ages. And so in each of these, there's a new world that appears and then disappears once again. And so, I mean, even Immanuel Kant, who I mentioned just a moment ago, sort of speculated about the birth and death of worlds. But despite the presence of eschatological questions in the work of the philosophers, it's really in religious thought that we encounter eschatological ideas. And even what I would consider false religions, whether you consider those religions primitive or advanced, although those can be taken as very pejorative terms, and I don't mean them to be taken that way. But even these false religions have an eschatology of some sort. I mean, Buddhism has nirvana. Islam has its garden of, shall we say, sensual delights. Belief in the continued existence of the soul, it just appears everywhere, and it appears in all sorts of forms. It may kind of manifest itself in the belief that the dead are still, near at hand, like it does in ancestor worship. It could show up in the belief that there is an underworld that is populated with the dead, for example, Hades that we find in Greek mythology. Or we could see its idea in the transmigration of the soul. But no matter what form it takes, it is always present in some form or another. And so in Christianity, the doctrine of last things, or eschatology, is a doctrine that has received significant attention because of the Christian belief that all of history is moving towards a consummation, right? And that consummation is the elect of God dwelling in the light of his presence for all eternity. But eschatology hasn't always received the same amount of attention throughout all periods of church history. And in some ways, our current obsession with eschatology is really unique. And so if you look at the history of the church, say from the apostolic age on through the beginning about the 5th century, the church was very conscious of the separate elements of this Christian hope in relationship to last things, or eschatology. And so they were perfectly aware, for example, that physical death is not identical with eternal death, that Christ is going to come again, and that there is going to be a blessed resurrection of God's people, and that's going to be followed by a general judgment where eternal doom is going to be pronounced on the wicked, whereas the righteous will be rewarded with, the eternal glories and bliss of heaven. But in that period from the apostolic age to about the 5th century, the elements that make up eschatology weren't really systematically arranged, and the interrelation between them all wasn't fully developed. And then if you go from the beginning of the 5th century on through the Reformation period, really, the doctrine of the church moves to center stage. And so as a result of that, then the hierarchical church, for example, the Church of Rome, was identified with the kingdom of God as kind of this one-to-one relationship. And so in this period, there's a great deal of attention that's given to the intermediate state and the idea of purgatory. And so that idea, the idea of purgatory, shifted the mediatorial activities of the church into the foreground, which meant that there was now a serious and significant emphasis on the Mass, on prayers for the dead, on indulgences, and those sort of things. But eschatology, as we understand it, it really isn't a focus in this period, except maybe in a handful of places. But for the most part, eschatology is a doctrine that's not really being developed because someone is devoting a significant amount of attention to it. And then if you go from the Reformation period on to the present, well, Reformation thought really centered around the idea of the appropriation and application of redemption. And so it develops eschatology primarily from that standpoint. And so a lot of the older Reformation theologians kind of treat eschatology as sort of an appendage to the doctrine of salvation, because eschatology does deal with and treat the question of the glorification of believers. And so for that reason, since glorification is a part of the application of redemption, then eschatology kind of got tacked on to the doctrine of soteriology. And so because of that, only a portion or a part of eschatology was studied and developed further kind of in the Reformation period. And the Reformation Church and the Reformation theologians adopted what the early church taught regarding Christ's return, the final judgment, life everlasting, while at the same time combating a really crass millennialism that was a part and parcel of the Anabaptist movement, especially in Munster. But the Reformation Church didn't really engage in a focused doctrinal development of eschatology, though there were men throughout the period, the first generation Reformation period, and then the periods that would later be called like early Reformed Orthodoxy and high Reformed Orthodoxy. There are men in those periods that are writing on the subject, but those works tend to be polemical, by which they tend to be an argument between various groups within the church and outside the church, heretical groups. And then in the aftermath of the Reformation, you have the rise of pietism and rationalism, and then evolutionary thought, obviously, with Darwin. And all of these really kind of choked out any focus on eschatology for a significant period of time. And eschatology has really only risen back to prominence in the last 150 to 250 years. And so this renewed emphasis on eschatology is really very much a new thing. And so I thought it would be helpful to take kind of this question of eschatology and offer sort of an overview of it for this video. So I hope that has been helpful for you guys to see how it's situated in both philosophy and world religions and in the history of the church. So stick around. We're going to do another video later this week where we're going to deal with some of the questions of individual eschatology. So really enjoying this, guys. God bless you. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the end of the video. I just want to say thank you for all of your support. And guys, if you're being helped by the content that I'm producing, please subscribe to the channel so that you can get updates. Give the video a like, and if you've got questions, leave them in the comments section below. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you have. So thank you all. God bless.